Welcome everybody to one more Talks at Google event. It is my extreme pleasure to welcome today Dr. William J. Perry. The occasion is the publication of his autobiographical book, My Journey at the Nuclear Brink, which also covers in detail a topic that we will discuss among other topics today, which is one of nuclear disarmament and the security in general in today's world. I'm not going to give a lengthy introduction of Mr. Perry because you all know how to use the Google search engine. But I will read from a foreword which was written by his colleague, former Secretary of State, George P. Shultz, and it is in the book. Throughout his life and work, William Perry has distinguished himself as a man of high intelligence, absolute integrity, rare vision, remarkable accomplishment, and an unwavering sense of humanity. Evidence of these attributes is vividly apparent in the gripping stories contained in this memoir, chronicling Bill's extraordinary efforts. I would also like to mention here, among all the honors that he was given throughout life, probably one of the most prestigious would be the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the United States' highest award for a civilian. And when he was presented with this award, President Clinton said, "Bill Perry may well be recorded as the most productive, effective Secretary of Defense the United States ever had." General John Shalikashvili, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, offered this assessment of this extraordinary public servant. Yes, he is a man of vast talent. Yes, he is a man of enormous energy and infectious enthusiasm. Yes, he is a man of great caring for those who wear our nation's uniform and for their families. But he is first and foremost a man of unshakable character. He's a man who will do what is right, no matter what the price. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Perry to Google. So I was originally planning to do the introduction, of your, younger years, because we want to connect in this show with the younger audiences and make them aware of a grave threat to our overall security. But this weekend's events forced us into, perhaps yet another territory that you have covered in your long career. And can you comment, or do you have any views on this latest of the events, which was the launch of a rocket by North Korea?
Yeah. I spent a lot of time in the 90s with the main mission of trying to keep North Korea from going nuclear for a lot of reasons. Well, I failed. And the consequences of that failure are yet to be played out, but we see some of the intermediate consequences. And they've already had a number of nuclear tests, at least 3 of which were successful. And they've been building missiles for a long time now. The missiles up to this point are medium-range missiles. They threaten South Korea, they threaten Japan, they do not threaten the United States. With their satellite launch, which is no problem in and of itself, but of course, to get the satellite into orbit, you have to use a launcher, and the launcher is essentially an Icbm. So while testing the satellite, they're also testing the early stages of an Icbm. If they perfect that, which they have said they plan to do, then they'll have a missile that can strike the United States as well. Even so, this is nothing if the warhead on it is high explosive. The real danger of a missile is not the missile, it's the fact that it could carry a nuclear warhead. So their nuclear tests are really more concern to us than the missile tests. the best judgment of the people I know who are really expert in the field of nuclear explosions, development of nuclear weapons, believe that the North Koreans at this point, while they have a successful nuclear bomb, do not have one that could be compact enough to be put into a warhead. That it might take 1 or 2 more nuclear tests before they'll be able to verify that kind of a design. So we're perhaps 1 or 2 tests, nuclear tests away, and maybe another 1 or 2 satellite or ICBM launches away from them having a nuclear ICBM, which could threaten the United States. So it begins to be a serious issue for us.
Dr. Perry, I wanted to go back on the track that I originally had in mind for our discussion today. Can you tell us a little bit about your younger age when you were like perhaps the younger members of our audience, and specifically I've heard that you've been in Hiroshima after the first explosions there. How what were your impressions at that young age?
Well, I was actually younger then than most of you. I was 14 when a young friend came rushing into the room and said, "We are at war. The Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor." This is one of these epiphany events where you remember decades later just where you were, what you were thinking, and so on. What I was thinking at the time, remember I was 14 years old, was I was afraid the war was going to be over before I could realize my dream, which was to be an Army Air Corps pilot and participate in the war. That's what a 14-year-old was thinking of those news. As it turned out, I was right. The peace treaty was signed in September of 1945, and I turned 18 in October of 1945, so I just missed. I did then sign up for the Army Engineers and was assigned to the Army of Occupation in Japan. I spent 2 months in Tokyo and then almost a year in Okinawa. What I saw in Tokyo and Okinawa changed my view altogether about the glamour and the glory of war. Tokyo, when I was there, was in ruins. It was more damage and more people killed than Hiroshima, actually, as a result of thousands and thousands of firebombs dropped over a period of 2 years. And nothing I had read or heard prepared me from just the shock of walking through the streets of Tokyo and seeing what was left of this once great city. When I got to Okinawa just 2 months later, Okinawa, you may not know the history of it, but it was the site of the last great battle of World War II. To give you some metric on it, there were 100,000 Japanese soldiers defending Okinawa. When the battle was over, a few months later, there were fewer than 10,000. 90% of them, 90,000 Japanese soldiers died, not just were wounded, they died in that battle, 90%. Either they were killed in battle or they committed suicide. Another 100,000 civilians. And about 15 or 20,000 Americans. Most of the American deaths, by the way, were a result of kamikaze attacks, suicide attacks on our ships. When our ship landed at Naha, which is the capital of Okinawa, there was not a building left standing. It was a city about the size of San Jose. Nothing was left standing. The people who survived were living in rubble. So that was my first exposure to what war is really like, not what you read about and what you hear about in speeches. I saw all those scenes of destruction. And then I reflected on Hiroshima. This is what could be done with 1,000-pound bombs. In the case of Tokyo, thousands of them over a 2-year period, and with thousands of bombers delivering them. The same result in Hiroshima. in an instant, one airplane and one bomb, just one bomb. And even at the tender age of 18, I understood this changed everything. Einstein had already said that the advent of the nuclear bomb, everything has changed, except the way we think. But when what I saw in Japan, Tokyo, and Okinawa, even at 18, my thinking did begin to change. I began to understand the vast significance of the role of nuclear weapons, how they changed everything, certainly about the way warfare would ever be waged again, and certainly putting an imperative that they must never, ever be used again.
I think this is probably the perfect place to roll the video to compare what today's young people think and know about the weapons.
So what do I know about nuclear weapons?
I know that nuclear weapons were invented in the mid-20th century.
There was a big scare, that was the Cold War, but nothing bad happened, luckily.
Like after what happened, like after we bombed the Japanese, like that's like the reason we haven't really had a world war, because everybody's scared, like nobody wants to get nuked.
Literally all I know is like, I don't want one to explode near me.
I hear everything pretty much dissolves that is within a certain mile radius.
You wouldn't almost hear anything. You'd kind of just see the light and it's out.
Well, I'd be dead, but let's say I were far enough so that I wouldn't be dead. I'd probably have some sort of cancer. Yay.
Well, I guess most of the more detailed knowledge I have came from a single book that I read.
Probably from movies and
jokes, TV.
I mean, video games, Fallout, playing those a lot.
In history class, we see in the history textbooks these big mushroom clouds. And you're like, whoa, that's terrifying. I don't want that.
I'm interested in physics. I, through that, pursued a little more of the scientific history of the discovery. Just a bit, though.
I would like to think, or I would hope, one.
I have no idea. I don't know. I would assume in the couple hundreds, but I wouldn't go as far as to say thousands.
Either a range between 2,000 and 4,000, or 200,000 and its whereabouts.
300.
I would guess that the United States possesses 10 million nuclear weapons.
I want to say like hundreds of thousands. But yeah, I think I'm short on that. I think we might have more.
I actually looked that up. I think it's like over 7,000.
Makes me feel better.
That's insane that the U.S. would have 7,000 nukes. Where are they? I would like to know.
I think that there can't be a winner because
no one's a winner if mass areas of the Earth become uninhabitable or like thousands, millions of people die.
I would probably not feel very victorious if I demolished a group of people.
We've used nuclear weapons and relatively little happened to us. So that's a little frightening. But that's pretty frightening.
Oh, like ISIS or Al Qaeda or something like that?
Definitely possible. I didn't expect 9/11 to happen in my lifetime either, so.
I don't really remember 9/11. I was like 5. So for people who have experienced breaches of national security, that's obviously a bigger concern.
I'd say like day to day, I don't really worry about terrorists setting off nuclear bombs.
I mean, if somebody got their hands on one of ours and used it against us, that's the worst. They didn't have to take it anywhere, it's already here.
odds are not going to happen. But also if it does happen, like there's no use in worrying about it because there's nothing I personally can do to stop it. So I might as well just live my life.
Well, it's certainly possible to have a nuclear weapon-free world.
It's if the U.S. does it, like, it might happen. But like all these other countries, like they see like, okay, like you're telling us to get rid of our nukes, but you're not gonna get rid of your nukes, so why should we?
If there's no more nuclear weapons or ingredients to make it, then we're going to find something else just as destructive.
I don't think it's very realistic that all countries abandon their nuclear weapons, mostly because I have almost no faith in the U.S. complying with something like that.
There's no way for it to happen if we don't like dare to like imagine that it's possible. And so so my answer to that question would be yes. And given that I don't really know that much about the state of like nuclear weapons today, right now, I don't know exactly how that would logistically like happen. But as a layperson who knows nothing, I would say yes, hopefully, yeah.
Fast forward, you've had a great entrepreneurial career, and then you ended up working for the government. And then comes your first crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about why that moment is important for our history?
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was actually working here in Silicon Valley at a defense electronics company. And I was called up, but I was also doing some pro bono consulting for the government in the field of technical missiles, technical factors about missiles. And I was called up one day and asked to come back to Washington for an urgent consulting job. And I said, sure, I'll rearrange my schedule and fly back, see you next Monday. He said, no, you don't understand. I need to see you right away. So I got on the red eye and flew back to Washington. The next morning, he took me into his office and to my amazement showed me pictures of Soviet missiles being deployed in Cuba. And that was my first introduction to what came to be called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for the next 8 days and nights, I worked on a small team of analysts looking at all the intelligence information coming in to try to determine the status of those missiles. How big were they? How far could they fly? When were they going to be operational? And that report went every morning on the desk of President Kennedy, who then used that as one of the factors to decide what he should be doing that day. I guess my bottom line is that every day I went into that analysis center, I believed would be my last day on Earth. That's how close we came to a nuclear catastrophe at that time. And I still believe, to this day, that we avoided that nuclear catastrophe as much by good luck as by good management.
We have learned some lessons in that particular episode, and we're talking about the era of the Cold War, the big polarization. They sort of de-escalated in the historical moment, and people thought that, well, we can control these weapons. But these are extremely complex systems. We have here Google engineers in the audience, and we're talking about many components in this system. There's a lot of engineering, there's a lot of communication, there's a lot of computer control that goes into that. Can anybody actually guarantee, the safety of such a complex system? Even if we had the will to say, oh, we're not going to launch first or whatnot, I think you had an episode, right, which shed some light on that.
No, the short answer to your system is no, we cannot guarantee it. And I've had several experiences in my own life that dramatize the point, but I'll share just one with you. At this time, I was in the Pentagon. I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. And I got a call. This is 1978. And I got a call one night at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I picked up the phone, barely awake. And the general on the other end of the line introduced himself as the watch officer at the North American Air Defense Command. And he said, my computers are showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. I'll tell you, I woke up right away. Talk about a bucket of cold water in the face. And one of the first things I thought about, why in the world is he calling me? I was not in the chain of command. I was in charge of research and engineering at the Pentagon. He was calling me because he had already determined, happily, there was a false alarm. And the question was, he was asking me is, what's wrong with my computer? What the hell is happening here? Well, the short answer is I could not, over the telephone, figure out what was wrong with his computers. It took us 2 days to find out what had happened. And what had happened was the sergeant who came in for his new watch that evening, instead of putting the operating tape into the computer, had put a training tape into the computer. And so what we got is a very realistic simulation of a launch. It was human error. You know, no matter how complex your systems are, they're always subject to human error. A second one, I didn't get called in the middle of the night, but I was involved in trying to fix the problem after it happened, was the watch officer was seeing 2 missiles on the way, 22 missiles on the way, 222 missiles on the way. He figured, you know, really very wisely, something was wrong with his equipment, he was right. And it took us a day or two to figure out what was wrong with it and how to fix it. So I was personally familiar with an example of human error and an example of equipment error. We did not launch, which is the good news. The reason we did not launch, beside the watch officer suspecting something was wrong, which in the second case was easy, but the first place was really pretty hard, was nothing bad was going on in the world at that time. And I've always asked myself on that first case, what if? What if it had occurred during a crisis? What if it occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis? What if it occurred during the Sinai crisis, which had occurred earlier, where we were at high alert, expecting some kind of a launch? In that case, would we have gone ahead and actually launched our missiles and accidentally started a nuclear war? So our subjects then, our systems then and now are subject to those kind of errors. The technical factor which exacerbates that is that one of our sets of nuclear missiles, namely our ICBMs, or intercontinental missiles, are subject to being destroyed in their silos if they're not launched. So if the watch officer reports to the president that his system is showing a launch underway, an attack on the United States, the president has about 10 minutes to decide whether he should order the launch of our ICBMs so that the missiles will be gone by the time the strike occurs. About 10 minutes. And obviously his decision is going to be heavily influenced by what's actually going on in the world at the time. So besides all this technical duplication and triplication and so on, besides all the sophisticated procedures we have, there's always the question of context. Context, what's happening in the world, which will affect the president's decision. He has about 10 minutes to digest that context plus the technical information to decide what to do. That was true then, it is still true today. By the way, I have just finished a paper which I'm about to publish, in which I recommend that as we begin the revitalization of our nuclear systems, we do not rebuild the ICBMs, precisely because they are susceptible to that kind of a false alarm problem. I am first to say that the probability of that leading to an accidental launch is very low. But why should we accept any probability? Why not simply let it go to zero? If you can eliminate the need for a quick launch, then you can basically avoid the problem of false alarm triggering an accidental war.
Let's take a couple of questions from the audience.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
It's a real privilege. So you just mentioned that we are considering revitalizing the next generation of our nuclear armament. How prepared do you think our politicians and our public are to consider this rearmament question?
The short answer is not at all. All you have to do to listen to the presidential debates is to understand that serious questions like this don't even enter the discussion. In fact, I'm just as happy they don't enter the discussion. It might create more noise than information. We are, and probably most of you are not aware of it, we are already proceeding on the rebuilding, the recapitalization, as they call it, of our nuclear Cold War arsenal. The Icbms, the SLBMs, the submarines, the bombers, the bombs. We're in the process of doing that. The cost will probably be upwards of $1 trillion over the next several decades. And that is happening basically without any public discussion. And we're just doing it. Now, any given year, when the appropriations are made to carry out that plan, there will be discussion and debate in the Congress. But so far, the public is not only not participating in that debate, they're not even aware of what's going on. And what they're not aware of is pretty much true of their representatives in Congress as well. There are a few exceptions to that in Congress, but not many.
Sorry, yeah, one of the things that you were known for in your time at the Pentagon was, I guess, modernizing the conventional technology of our military. But as you said, we're looking at now the nuclear side of the equation. If you were still at the Pentagon and you were, in charge of making recommendations about whether we should, and if we should, how should we modernize our nuclear weapons, what would you say? What do you think that we should do, if anything? Assuming that for whatever reason, immediate unilateral disarmament isn't.
Well, in interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that I participated with George Shultz and Henry Kissinger and Sam Nunn in 3 or 4 op-eds over the period of the last 6 or 7 years recommending we should be moving towards zero nuclear weapons. So I'm not a fan of nuclear weapons. With the developments in Russia in the last few years, and with Russia already well embarked on rebuilding their Cold War arsenal, I don't feel that that's politically feasible right now. And so my main objective now is trying to minimize the damage, trying to recommend that we proceed in ways in our rebuilding of the arsenal that are least costly and least dangerous. And on that basis, I've recommended no ICBMs at all, let the ICBM force phase out. No air-launched cruise missile, let that phase out. And on the so-called tactical nuclear bomb, the B-61 bomb, which we're now refreshing, not to introduce into it a low yield. Now, why should I be in favor of a high yield, not a low yield? It's because the low yield invites the commanders to believe that it's a usable weapon. I want to keep the threshold of using nuclear weapons very, very high. So you do not believe that a nuclear weapon is just like a big conventional weapon, that there's something entirely different and you should never use them. So I do not like the idea of making nuclear bombs more usable, which lowering the yields does. So those would be the main points I would be pressing. But more importantly, even as the Secretary of Defense, you have something to say about policy and diplomacy. I'd be urging the President to re-engage seriously with the Russians and see if together we can agree to stop altogether this rebuilding of the Cold War nuclear arsenal. If we're not successful in that, though, then I'm willing to support a program, but a much less expensive and a much less dangerous program than the one we are now embarked on. I would support the submarine missiles because they have no possibility of false alarm. And I would support building a new bomber because it can be used for conventional forces, as the present B-2 is used. And in this case, it provides a sort of a belt and suspenders approach in case something happens to our submarine force, which I think is very unlikely. But to build the ICBMs, the third part of the triad is that using belt and suspenders for the belt and suspenders. I think it's just silly.
Ideally, though, I mean, if we look at the world today, it seems that two of the major risks are the worsening of the relation with the Soviet Union and like the policies that are happening both around Ukraine and Syria recently. And the other is the potential for like a terrorist, a non-state actor, to get their hands on nuclear material. Would you agree that those
Yes.
are the two?
The first one could lead to an accidental or a war by nuclear accidental war or a war by miscalculation. The second, terrorism, could lead to one bomb going off in Washington or San Francisco, or maybe a couple of bombs. And we tend to minimize what that means. In the preface to my book, there's a scenario. It's a hypothetical scenario, but a very believable, very real scenario. That real is based on real facts. And in this scenario, a terrorist gets one nuclear bomb. And I describe how it could happen. And he sets it off Pennsylvania Avenue, halfway between the White House and the Capitol. The majority of congressmen are killed, in my scenario. The president and the vice president are killed. The Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Staff were testifying at the Congress at the time this happened. They were killed. The presidency devolves to the president pro tem of the Senate, who is in Mayo Clinic in Cleveland being treated for pancreatic cancer. So we have a constitutional crisis. The terrorists deliver a message to our TV stations, which broadcast all over the country, saying, that was the first bomb. We have 5 other bombs planted in 5 other cities in the United States. They're going to go off once a week from now on. Stop to imagine what happens to our cities when that happens, which is people streaming out of the cities. All of our industry shut down, our economy grinds to a halt. The country goes into complete and total. This is one bomb. He doesn't even have to have the other 5 bombs. He just says he has them. So one bomb could cause that kind of absolute and total chaos. It makes 9/11 look like a social outing almost. It's really, really catastrophic. But people don't really think seriously about the consequences for them. Besides the 100,000 people who are killed, there are social and economic and political consequences which are really quite profound. And we're just sitting here blissfully unaware of what could happen. Now, an accidental or a nuclear war or war by miscalculation is not a high probability at all. But nuclear terrorism is really quite believable. It takes the terrorist getting a hold of 20 or 30 kilograms of fissile material. If he has that, the making of the bomb is not that difficult. We make it difficult, but we want to compress them so they're small enough to fit into warheads, operate under highly stressed conditions. But if all he wants to do with the bomb is put it in a truck and drive it down Pennsylvania Avenue, it's not that difficult to make. The barrier today, the reason that hasn't happened today, is he doesn't have the 20 or 30 kilograms of fissile material. The one bit of good news I have for you is that of all the initiatives of President Obama in this field, most of which I'm very critical of, but the one I'm very supportive of is something called the Nuclear Summit, where he convened 3 times now in his terms in office. The 50 heads of state, all of whom are focused on the question, what can we do to protect our fissile material better than we're now protecting it? And there have been significant improvements in the last 4 or 5 years because of that. The next such meeting, by the way, comes up in 2 months, and it's going to be in Washington. And I have high hopes that that will really drive home this protection message quite a bit to the ultimate conclusion.
Secretary Perry, sort of related to that, so I've been impressed that over the last half-century plus, the international community has done kind of an amazing job of slowing down nuclear proliferation but it also sort of seems that at some point that effort is going to kind of fail and you're going to have large numbers of states with nuclear weapons. So is there something we can do about that?
Several decades ago, most of the nations of the world signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is in force today. And that is the main reason that what President Kennedy predicted back in the 60s, namely that we'd have 30 nuclear countries by the end of the century, has not happened. So we owe a lot to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation, nicknamed the NPT. The NPT is in danger now for several reasons, one of which is the two proliferant threats of the last few years, one of them being North Korea, and nobody's found a good way of stopping North Korea yet, and the other being Iran. Iran, by really an amazing concerted effort of the international community, we've reached an agreement with Iran, which is highly criticized in this country by about 55% of our Congress and by Prime Minister Netanyahu. Also, is highly criticized, I might say, by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The irony is, of course, that they're criticizing it for entirely different reasons. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard is critical because they fear it will not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon, which they want to get. Of course, Netanyahu and 55% members of Congress who are opposing it because they fear it will not stop them from getting a nuclear weapon, which they would like to stop. So, of course, they both cannot be right. But that's where we stand right now on that issue. The presidential debates have gotten into the state of purely ridiculous in discussing this with several of the Republican candidates simply saying flatly the first day in office they're going to terminate the nuclear deal with Iran, which my Republican friend George Shultz just has the most ridiculous statement you could possibly make. What it does was it gives Iran all the benefits without holding them to any responsibilities. Because it is a fantasy to believe that we could now go back and renegotiate. The reason Iran negotiated in the first place was that for once in history, the international community came together on a very effective series of sanctions. The sanctions hurt Iran enough that they were willing to sit down and negotiate a reasonable deal. The minute the United States walks out of the deal, those sanctions go away. The Europeans would never, ever support a reimposition of the sanctions, and unilateral sanctions by the U.S. would not have that much of an effect. So that is demonstrably a foolish thing to do. But those are it's a continual battle in the area of trying to stop proliferation. If Iran were in fact to get a nuclear weapon, there is no doubt that at least 4 or 5 other countries in their neighborhood would follow suit right away. Let me tell you one other thing about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has 2 aspects to it. One of them is the non-nuclear powers agreeing not to build nuclear weapons, for which they get certain benefits like nuclear technology for the reactors. The other half of it is the nuclear powers, of which the United States, of course, is one, agreeing to work towards the decrease of the nuclear weapons and ultimately leading to the elimination of nuclear weapons. Demonstrably, the second part of that is not being followed today. So the United States and Russia in particular are clearly in violation, as we see it today, of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that fact does not go unobserved.
Thank you. So what's your view on China's nuclear policy, especially on their kind of creative use of some of the Icbm technology? So they have some anti-missile, anti-ship ICBMs. They also have something, well, yeah, that's all. So what's your view on their policy and their kind of technologies?
China has had an ICBM for a good many years. In fact, my first visit to China, which was 36 years ago, I was at the time the Undersecretary of Defense. They took me out to the missile test range. They showed me their ICBM on its launch pad. So they have at least had an ICBM for at least 36 years. I, with my own eyeballs, have seen it. For many decades since then, their policy was to maintain a minimal deterrence. That has a special meaning. I mean, just enough ICBMs to discourage people from attacking you, but not enough to cause trouble. Not enough to initiate trouble on your own. That's technically called a minimal deterrence, and China not only had that kind of a force, but they have proclaimed that's the kind of a force they have. And so none of us who have been in this field have been much concerned about the Chinese nuclear force being a threat to anybody else. A minimal deterrence, by definition, means you're not going to use the force. It's only there to protect yourself from being attacked. In the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, they have been rebuilding their nuclear forces and their ICBM forces and their submarine missile forces. They're obviously moving beyond the minimal deterrence force, which I think is not good news, but we do not know yet how far beyond they're actually moving. So that issue remains unresolved at this point. I'm hopeful that they're still staying more or less within the minimal deterrence policy, even though they're modernizing and improving and strengthening their forces. As it stands now, they represent, I think, no threat to any other country that's not trying to threaten them.
Some people have said that the border between Pakistan and India is the most dangerous border in the world because both nations have nuclear weapons. They acquired that technology relatively recently, and frankly, both nations hate each other. So what steps could be taken, I suppose, to mitigate the risk of nuclear war in that region?
I would say that today, Pakistan represents the greatest danger in the world to a nuclear catastrophe actually happening. I haven't talked about it much. I've talked about nuclear terrorism. I've talked about a possible accidental war between Russia and the United States. But I think more likely than either of those would be a regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan. And the scenario, it evolved from just the situation you described, the dispute over Kashmir, dispute has gone on now for decades, no closer today of resolution than it was when it started decades ago. And there have been 3 or perhaps 4 conventional wars between India and Pakistan during that time, all of which Pakistan has lost because they have a smaller country and have smaller military forces. They have responded to this inferiority in size and power with irregular warfare, in particular with terrorism. And the Pakistani government has more or less supported terror groups to do their bidding in Kashmir. But sometimes these terror groups get off the reservation. And that happened a few years ago at a place called Mumbai, or what we used to call Bombay. And there was a very serious terror attack on Mumbai by a group, a Pakistan terror group, which the Indian government was able to identify had some connections with the Pakistani government. India very wisely showed restraint and did not invade Pakistan when that happened. The question now is what happens if there is another such attack, a Mumbai 2, so to speak. We had Shultz and I have had several meetings at Stanford with India and Pakistan, very senior people from India and Pakistan, discussing this very issue. And it seemed very clear to both sides that if that happened again, that first of all, the Pakistani side would say they couldn't be sure the government could prevent it from happening again. They didn't have that much control over these terror groups. And the Indian government said if it happened again, the Indian government would feel obliged to have some sort of a punishment, a punitive, which would probably be a punitive military incursion into Pakistan by the Indian Army. In which case the Pakistani side would say, if that happened, the Pakistanis, rather than losing to the superior military force, would use something which they call tactical nuclear weapons. Now, I have to tell you, a tactical nuclear weapon is a misnomer. What it means is a nuclear weapon that can be used by tactical forces to fight a war, not for deterrence. But it goes off with a bang, like the Hiroshima bomb. So don't be misled by the word tactical. These are big bombs. So the Pakistanis thought their government, rather than see itself humiliated by having its army defeated, would use a tactical nuclear bomb within Pakistan against the Indian Army forces there, hoping that the Indian government would not respond to nuclear weapons. The Indians all believed that if that happened, the Indian government would respond. So that was that's a definition of how a nuclear war, a regional nuclear war, could get started. That scenario is all too plausible. So for that reason, I would agree with the assertion that the border between India and Pakistan is perhaps the most dangerous place in the world today. The second most dangerous place would be the border between South Korea and North Korea.
Dr. Perry, I want to step a little bit away from all the complexities that you have described today. I mean, this is very useful information, and I am sure that you work with a lot of current politicians in trying to think about political solutions. But I also would like to introduce the work that you started doing with the organization that you and your daughter have founded, that is trying to reach the younger audience. And perhaps you have something to offer to sort of, like the normal man who is not sitting in Washington, D.C., who is, like going to his everyday job and whatnot. How can they get involved? How can, like I make a difference? How can, like my colleague make a difference in like trying to defuse this very volatile situation?
You may have inferred from what I've already said that I do not have great confidence in the political forces in Washington today or in Moscow today recognizing and resolving the very serious issues that we face. And I think a large reason for that is because our populace as a whole does not understand it. That's why we conducted this survey. It's just a random survey of young people. What do you know about nuclear weapons? The answer is abysmal ignorance. And along with the ignorance, not much concern. So we said if we're really going to get sensible policies for dealing with the dangers which we're waving our arms about, you can wave your arms and all you want, but you have to have policies to correct the problems. We have to find a way of educating people, particularly educating young people on this issue. The kids you saw in that video not only didn't know about the Cold War, they didn't even know about 9/11. So this is a grossly uninformed population. And so we're setting out an educational program to try to deal with that problem, and an education program directed primarily at young adults. We believe that the reason our policies are so inadequate today, let me back up and say more directly. Complete declarative statement is that the danger of a nuclear catastrophe today, of one of the kinds we talked about, the danger of a catastrophe today is greater than it was during the Cold War. Is greater than it was during the Cold War. We've documented that several various ways. I talk about it in great detail in my book, and I'm just writing another paper now dealing specifically with it, why I believe that to be true and how I can document it, why I believe it's an accurate way of assessing it. If it's greater today, it's also perfectly clear that our policies are not adequate for dealing with those dangers. We're blissfully going ahead, both we and Russia, rebuilding the Cold War nuclear arsenal. Never mind the $1 trillion costs associated with it. The dangers associated with that are very, very real. So we need a program of education. You can't rant about policies if you don't understand the underlying issues. So the first step is education, and it has to be some kind of a mass education. So I teach a course at Stanford on this subject. I get a couple hundred students, which is nice, but that doesn't influence what's going on in the world. I had to find a way of getting this message through to hundreds of thousands of students, or even millions of young people. And so obviously the internet is the only way to do that. And we're trying in our project to put together media that can work, that can be effective over the internet and which will attract young people to read it and get engaged with it. One of the reasons I'm happy to talk with this group today is we need help in what we're doing, and certainly no one ought to be better qualified how to effectively use the internet to communicate with millions of people than people here at Google. So we're in our own fumbling way doing these things now. We're preparing videos, of which you saw one. You did not see the video we prepared on nuclear terrorism, which actually lays out the scenario I described to you about an attack on Washington.
That video is available online on your Commonwealth Club
yeah,
talk.
Absolutely. It is certainly available online. But it's a powerful video which drives home how real this problem is and how serious it is. So we would like very much to get people interested in this by educating them. And what can they do once they get educated? The first thing is to help educate others. Focus on specific policy issues. For example, the issue of should we be rebuilding our ICBM force? It's a very concrete, specific issue. And you could build up quite a head of steam in trying to to try to slow that process down if you get enough people concerned about it and talking about it and debating it. But it takes masses of people. It can't be done with a classroom of people. It has to be, and again, that means you have to communicate over the internet. One other thing I would say on this is that knowledge, of course, is necessary before you can speak intelligently about these problems, but you also must have conviction that this is a serious problem. Not only your future depends on it, but your children's future depends upon it if you want to do something about it. I want to give you, sort of end up my comment here by giving you a quote from the Irish poet W.B. William Butler Yeats, who said something very meaningful on this problem. I'll just get it quoted for you exactly. He said, the best lack conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And that's what I see when I look out in the world today. I see people ranting and raving passionately about how vital it is to be rebuilding all of our ICBMs and so on. And the rest, well, you saw them in the picture up there. What can I do? That's not a sufficient answer. If you have the conviction, you educate yourself. You help educate other people. You associate yourself with a group, like our group, for example, that is actually working on the problem and help them do it. There are things you can do if you, first of all, get the conviction that you should be doing something, and then secondly, take the time to educate yourself on what the real issues are.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Perry for visiting us here at Google.